scripture passage today is from the book of Acts, chapter 9. This is Paul's conversion from Saul to Paul on the road to Damascus. Meanwhile, Saul was breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord. Went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogue at Damascus, so that if he found any who belonged to the way, men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. Now, as he was going along and approaching Damascus, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to him, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" He asked, "Who are you, Lord?" The reply came, "I am Jesus whom you are persecuting. But get up and enter the city, and you will be told what you are to do." The men who were traveling with him stood speechless because they heard the voice but saw no one. Saul got up from the ground, and though his eyes were open, he could see nothing. So they led him by the hand and brought him into Damascus. For 3 days he was without sight and neither ate nor drank. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. So we still have our butterflies that we folded over Lent, and that were on the wall for Easter Sunday. That we took and we put in the bucket, committing to make a difference in the gun violence for our schools, protection of our schools. And so I'm keeping these through this month, just as a symbol for us to keep in front of us for our theme for the month, which is transformation. Now, there are lots of really great stories about the life of butterflies. Just the whole transformation from caterpillar to butterfly is fantastic. And I don't know if you've had the privilege of having one of those little cages and watched it go from the cocoon into a butterfly. It never happens when you're actually watching, does it? I can't tell you how many times we've done it with the kids, and it must have happened during the night. We missed it. Of course, there's YouTube videos on it, but you want to see your butterfly, right, come out. And yet it's still spectacular to know that happens. But there's also butterflies in the world that have even more remarkable lives. I'm sure you know the story of the monarch butterfly, the life cycle of the monarch butterfly. Not everyone knows this. So if this is your first time, I want you ready to be amazed, okay? And even if you know the story, I want you also to be amazed, because it is truly astonishing that this happens. So pretend this is a monarch butterfly. They winter in Mexico, in the mountains of Mexico. They winter in the mountains of Mexico because there's old growth forests in those hills that are old enough that they hold in heat all winter long. And so they gather heat from these old trees to last through the winter, and they huddle up next to each other so that they can stay warm through the light frosts of winter. So the frost would otherwise kill them. But together and on those old growth trees, they can survive the winter. And then come spring, they head north. And they end up somewhere in Texas. And that's the first generation. When they make it to Texas, they mate, they lay their eggs, and they die. And so then from Texas, those newborn monarch butterflies, they go through 5 stages after hatching from their eggs. They get to caterpillar, and then they get to a bigger caterpillar, and a bigger caterpillar, and a bigger caterpillar. And then they turn into a pupa inside the chrysalis. And then they turn into a butterfly. So they go through 8 different stages to make, including a butterfly. And then when they're in Texas, they start heading further north. And maybe they'll make it to Kansas, somewhere around in there. This is the second generation. The first, we'll count this the first generation. So from Texas north, that's one generation. And then that same cycle will happen again. That eggs are laid. Once they arrive, they lay their eggs, and they go through all the stages, and then they become a butterfly again. And they keep heading north. And they go even further north. Maybe they make it to Missouri or something like that. They head north, even further north, and they go through that same cycle again of eggs, caterpillar, butterfly. And then they continue to head north. So this happens all summer long, that the monarch butterflies are heading north. And then they make it to Canada. They make it to Canada, and they don't do their usual thing. They are born from the egg. They eat all their caterpillar stages, and they become a butterfly, and something triggers in them. They're going to have a different life. Even though it was three generations before that lived differently, they're going to do something different. They immediately, as soon as they become a butterfly, they start heading south. Where and how they remember what their great-great-grandparents did, who knows? So they start heading south, and they travel 2,000 miles back to the mountains of Mexico. They go through all kinds of perils along the way, and the scientists have looked at the butterflies hanging in the trees in Mexico, and they are tattered and torn because they have flown 2,000 miles to Mexico, to winter in Mexico. Those who don't make it, the first frost, they're dead. But it's something about this place that they have forever come back to after several generations. Anyway, so they winter there, and then once it starts to warm up, and then they start heading north, and then they lay their eggs, and they start having this whole heading north cycle. So it takes, the whole cycle takes 4 generations. 4 generations. The 4th generation remembers what 4 generations before had done and followed the same path. They can even take butterflies that are heading in the Midwest, coming down by way of the Midwest, and take them over to, D.C. And they will take about a day and head in the wrong direction, and then they'll start heading a little bit west, southwest, instead of just south. They have some way of figuring it out. Anyway, it's pretty amazing. I hope you all were amazed. I told this story to a Camino friend of mine from Holland, and I really don't think she believed me. There's no way that a butterfly can travel 2,000 miles. That's not even the longest migration of butterflies, actually, in the world. But it is ours. It is our North American Eastern monarch butterfly journey. So that transformation can take generations. And it can be a tug of the heart, a tug of our life that we don't really know what turns on that last generation to turn south. We don't always know what turns our transformation on, a personal transformation, but that it does happen is evident in so many ways. We talked about, on Easter Sunday, we talked about the transformation that this church has experienced through the warming shelter, and just how many lives have been touched, just how many lives are touched with this building and the way that we open it up, and so many people experience transformation through the services and the wonderful groups that we have here. So that was Easter. We talked about transformation, ways that the church makes a difference. And then last Sunday we talked about the church's history with the LGBTQ issues and how that has changed over time. And we expect it to continue to change and transform. And we stand on an edge, not sure what the future will be. So 2 weeks of preaching on transformation, and I guess I've come to the realization, and why this is a surprise, I don't know. Change is everywhere. Anybody else surprised by that? And yet we resist it at every moment. Oh, I'm not going to give that up. I'm not going to do that. No, I don't want to go there. No, I'm going to go this same path to work. If they change anything downtown for a pear blossom, I am so upset. I can't figure out how to get here. You'd think I didn't live here 10 years. Yeah, we're such creatures of habit that we're surprised that change is also one of the primary characteristics of the universe, not just our lives. And yet when we look back over history, look in the past, as I mentioned last week, we can see tons of change. And all that change, a lot of it was transformational. A lot of it was transformational. Now, what makes the difference between change that's just change and change that's not transformational? The key is the very core of our calling as Christians. We are called to love God and love our neighbor. And that, to me, is the core of transformation rather than just change. When we see change happen that's guided and directed by that pull, almost like that fourth generation of butterflies, we're heading south. I'm heading in a totally different direction. We could say it's that absolute identification that we as children of God at our very core are to love God and love our neighbor. What a better way to be exactly who God created us to be. That's why in the story, now this is when Paul is still Saul. His transformation was so great that it required a name change. Have you ever felt that way? I am not the person I used to be. I am not the person I used to be. Well, for sure with Saul, it starts off that he was, let us not underestimate this, he was a murderer. He was breathing threats and murder. And he had already seen people stoned. He'd already, pursued other Christians. And he was so well known in the Christian church, in the following called the Way, that he was the most feared persecutor of his day. We don't really know how many people he actually brought to death, but we know it happened. So the verse starts with, he was breathing threats and murder. And so he goes and gets permission to bring back some of these followers of the Way, these Christians. So there was such threat for their life, led by Saul. And so his transformation was so great that it required this bright light experience. Now, I don't know about you, but this is just not how I became a Christian. Did it happen to you that way? Just don't remember walking down the road and a light bright shining, or I didn't change my name. I didn't go blind for a couple of days. but also wasn't a murderer of the way. I think that this is so extreme because Saul was such a bad guy. So it's not that we look at our life and say, well, God doesn't or can't use me or doesn't want me as much as God wanted Saul. Is that maybe God doesn't require that much of an action to get our attention. But for Saul, he needed that to make such a drastic change in his life, from a murderer to a follower. So he receives this bright light as he's walking, and he's blinded, and he's told, why are you persecuting me? And he doesn't know who it is, because he'd been persecuting all those people following Jesus. And Jesus identifies himself, and I get the feeling that his blindness happened after, that he did see Jesus. And then he was blind from the amazing experience of that. And his follower, the people that are traveling with him, they have some kind of experience also. And so they take him to Damascus, and he's blind for a couple of days, and he doesn't eat, so he fasts for a couple of days. And it's that scenario that begins his transformation. Now, of course, Jesus showed this great light, but that's not the end of his transformation. Elsewhere, he says that he goes away to Arabia for 3 years. So transformation takes a while. But while he's there in Damascus, he also gets some other help. The Spirit comes to a follower of Jesus. His name is Ananias. It says, Ananias, Saul is in your town. I want you to go and take care of him. Saul, the murderer, yes, that's the very one. I want you to go take care of him. But what if he murders me? So the transformation of Saul took some transformation of some other people also. Transformation of their own fear for their own life. And isn't that beautiful that our transformation is tied up with each other? When we start getting transformed, we end up bringing other people along with that. We see that in recovery, right? Someone starts sobering up, surprising who else is going to become sobered up. When our lives start changing, other lives start changing also. So he gets healed from sight by Ananias. He comes and like scales come off his eyes. And he can see again. And this is the beginning of his transformation. So what would it mean if we really believed that our faith can change us? Now, I don't know about you, but I look into other people's lives all the time. It's part of my job as a pastor that I stand next to people and see their lives. And I can see a light in their life. God pointing a flashlight, right here is where I want you to work on. And they can live oblivious. And I stand there going, boy, that's awfully obvious to me. What if we really believed that God could be a part of our transformation? Or that God is even guiding us toward transformation? Now, I know I'm raised Southern Baptist, so this is about as evangelical a sermon as you will ever hear me give. And I had to really get over that. You can't talk about transformation and not be a little evangelical. Because I was accustomed to my childhood every single Sunday to hear at least 7 or 8 just as I am verses. Maybe you've been in such a worship service as I have when I was growing up. And so every single service ended with this climax of, how is God changing you? Aren't you going to change? Aren't you going to become a Christian? Was always the focus. And so they focused on this one question. But what I see as a pastor is I see the light of God shining in so many lives, not just over that one question, but over all kinds of areas. Are you going to come out of the closet and be who you really are? Are you going to finally face how that drink is hurting your marriage? Is your anxiety caused by a brokenness with your children? Are you depressed because you're not really doing what God called you to do with your life? I see transformation possibilities in so many ways. Not just in, are you going to become a Christian? And what that means to me now, as a United Methodist pastor, is that we take the life of Jesus as the model for our lives. To me, that's the simplest definition of what a Christian is. So if we can live our story lined up with the narrative of Jesus, what a better model for transformation potential for each of us. We have the flashlight in our life, the bright light, whatever you want to say. It's called the life of Jesus. So, the problem with evangelical messages is that, I'm not very good at prodding someone to movement. You ask my kids, as soon as they, have any resistance to anything, I'm like, oh, that's fine, let's figure out a different way. And so, I'm not one that's going to prod you, but I am going to ask you, what if we assumed that God was shining a light in our life? You have to look at your life, not the one that you're sitting next to. It might be easier to look at that person's life. That's true as a pastor. I can see it in other people better than I can my own. But what if we lived assuming that there is light in our life from God? That God longs for that next step to be instinctual. Like the butterfly that wakes up and knows to head south. What if our next step in transformation was obvious? And yet we resist, just like Paul. We offer resistance. I don't think it's just resistance to change. I think often it's resistance to believing that God really cares about us. That God has a plan for us. God has dreams for us. God has dreams for this world, and we are a part of it. Here's some signs that God might be shining light into your life. Do you ever get angry when you turn the TV on? Anybody else get angry? That is God prodding you to do something about it. When are we going to start listening to our anger as a cue to what God has created in us, to what we should be doing? And this one's painful. Do you suffer from anxiety or depression? Could that be God trying to reach you? And make new connections in your life? Do you ever feel alone? This is a very lonely world at times. Could that be God saying, there are others just like you, go make a difference? I don't know exactly what your transformation needs to be, will be, but I can promise you that change is on the horizon. It happens whether we want it or not. But the beauty of transformation is that we get to be in connection with God in that change. That change just doesn't happen naturally and without cause and without focus or motivation or direction. That we're not going downhill, per se. But instead that we're God-guided change. God-guided change. Rather be proactive than just letting it happen. I was really uncomfortable with this sermon because it's so evangelical. And I didn't dare put just as I am at the end of service. I might have been tempted to let it go on too long. So if you find the very comment of, do I need to transform? If you find that, a little scary about yourself, please know that it is in love and care that I believe God wants the very best of all of us. And I think that we are happier when we live into that. Right? So this is an evangelical message, prodding you, but with love. So the question is, what if we assume God has a light already shining in our life? Just like Paul, transforming us. Let us step into it and hear that tug of our heart in a particular direction, not just general, but a particular direction. I can guarantee it's happening in your life. May we live with the cakes that's on our eyes off into this day. Amen.